handsome guy, and she bring him home for a little bite. When it's understood that the food is good and the night is young and another word, then he must oblige, then he must oblige. If the pretty girl has a figure right, then the handsome guy has an appetite. She provide the plate, she provide the taste. When she give the wine, she will take up the cake. Then he must oblige, then he must oblige. Where's your table manners?
So there's something about the dinner party. It is a rite of passage. It's one of the ways you know you're grown up, right? You can have a dinner party. You actually have matching chairs at your table. Maybe you have some halfway decent china you got in your wedding or something. There is a passage to adulthood that runs through the idea of the dinner party. It's also just been around forever. I mean, I just got through doing a show about the Roman Empire, so I've got to mention the Feast of Trimalchio. And Trimalchio, which is in Petronius' Satyricon, that shows you the way the dinner party is also kind of a flex. Trimalchio is a former slave, and he's become quite wealthy and very ostentatious, and he kind of tries to out-dinner party or out-feast everybody else significantly. F. Scott Fitzgerald had Trimalchio in West Egg as the working title for what became The Great Gatsby. That idea, too, of the dinner party as a flex, a way of showing what your resources are, what kind of china you own, what kind of Gosford Park dinner you can put on. I think it's there all the time. But the rest of us are mere mortals. We live in the world. We give dinner parties or we go to them. And we're going to talk about that today and maybe whether the idea is a little bit endangered. The dinner party has been pronounced dead before and probably will be again. But here to get us started with the life of the dinner party is Rand Richards Cooper, a fiction writer, contributing editor at Commonweal, restaurant critic for the Hartford Courant, and a regular guest on the Colin McEnroe Show, and giver of celebrated dinner parties. So, Rand, welcome back to the Colin McEnroe Show.
Hey, Colin, thanks. It's good to be here, especially with a glass of rosé.
So you take, I mean, I've known you for many years. You do take pride in at least thinking through a lot of different elements that lead up to a successful dinner party. Maybe just run through a few of those elements. I mean, it ranges from guests to menu to maybe theme. Talk about all of those.
I was thinking, Colin, and your helpful intro with Trimalchio, I was thinking about the different kinds of dinner parties that we go to and that we enjoy. Some of my friends throw, in the West End in Hartford, where we live, terrific potluck parties that are just completely free-form parties. And I think of a couple friends in particular who I think of as terrific partygoers of that kind of party. On the other hand, there are more formal dinners. And I tend to, I think, try to combine those two things. That is, to have perhaps a more structured party than the typical West End potluck free-for-all, which I do love, and have a more set meal and set places at the table. But then I hope that it then degenerates a little bit into more of a free-for-all. So I like to have a sort of set form and then gradually deconstruct it a little bit as the night goes on. The ultimate goal of any party giver is that you want people to never want to leave. And Colin, probably everyone does, to go to a dinner party where all you want to do is leave. It's an excruciating thing. So all people who throw parties have different strategies for trying to prevent that from happening.
And we should say you're a really good cook. You're somebody who writes about food and has traveled the world enjoying food. And one of the things that strikes me is about those two parties, that dichotomy that you just set up. I think when we're younger, we do more of the former. And there's sort of maybe a liminal period where, we're married and starting our adult lives. But it's like all we can do to really make up a big pot of spaghetti sauce and have 6 people come over. And that's just great anyway. But I feel as though, and maybe, I don't know whether it's a Connecticut thing or an East Coast thing or an American thing, there's a performative quality to dinner parties. I mean, the people who are really good at cooking, like you really put on this amazing spread of just wonderfully thought out courses of the meal. And it's all beautifully done. And maybe there's some young person named Counsel walking around serving you things. And it's just, and sometimes I'm at the dinner party and I'm thinking the effort of reciprocating, not just your dinner parties, but lots of people's. I think the effort of reciprocating is daunting. The idea of kind of just being able to put on that meal, and have it just go so wonderfully and seamlessly, it might be a little intimidating to somebody less skilled. And I wonder if that kind of puts a crimp in how people socialize.
I don't think. I hope it doesn't put a crimp in it at my parties. Some of the parties I sent you some menus. You know, there is in the West End of Hartford an annual fundraiser called the Dine Around, and you pay a not insignificant amount of money. It goes to fund the West End Civic Association, and I think there's the feeling if you're throwing a party that since people are paying $100 to come to your house, you want it to be special and not just, you know, put a tin of lasagna in front of them. And there are stories about these terrible parties where the person apparently didn't understand that a certain level of effort was required and just put the lasagna out there. I generally use mine, you know, as you know, Colin, for years I worked as a culinary travel writer for Bon Appetit. And those were assignments like, you know, go to the Greek islands for 8 days, eat as much as possible, interview some chefs, and produce a narrative. Pretty much the greatest job ever. Without fail, I would come back from those trips with some meal or ingredient that I hadn't really eaten before, and then I would make that again and again and again for weeks. So I used the occasion of these more formal dinner parties in the West End dining series to sort of resurrect a whole bunch of food and travel memories. You know, I think we all have experienced sometimes the memory of a meal is kind of inextricably tied to a number of non-specifically culinary things, where we were, who we were with someone we were in love with, were we with our three best pals, were we in you know, a little cafe in some foreign city where what otherwise might have been an absolutely mundane plate of, you know, ravioli with sage and butter sauce was transmogrified by the beauty of the surroundings and the specialness of the trip. And so you come home with these food and place memories. I love using a dinner party, you know, to try to recreate them. And that also conduces to a lot of stories, you know, around the dinner table. At any party that I'm guessing you care about, and any party that I care about and have loved, ultimately, the great treat that we're all consuming is each other's presence and each other's conversation. So, you know, everything you're doing, in addition to pleasing people with food, is to try to provide an occasion to spur that conversation. I will say, I vastly prefer attending other people's parties to giving my own. One thing I'm really bad at, and I really admire party givers who can do this well. I'm a terrible multitasker, and I'm also a little bit of a control freak. Several friends of mine are people who can hang out in the kitchen cooking for the dinner party to come and welcoming you being in there, having a drink, talking with them, helping them. So my friend Catherine Blinder, who's also your friend, who I consider to be just about the best dinner party host I know. One of her great virtues as a hostess is you can hang out with her in the kitchen while she's preparing the meal, and you can all drink and nibble and talk, and it can be 5 people talk. I can't deal with that at all. I'm getting the stuff ready in the kitchen. I want you to get the hell out. I can't even listen to your conversation. So for me, when I'm at someone else's party, since I have no responsibilities, and by the way, my wife Molly, generous person that she is, she's the person who, if you're throwing the party, she's going to be helping you out, cleaning up afterwards, helping you serve, doing everything. When I'm at someone else's party, I don't want to do anything. I just want to sit back, hang with friends, and talk and be served. Although
I've been at dinner parties where people struggled to get out into the kitchen and help with the dishes just because of what was happening at the dinner table. I mean, it all depends on a felicitous and convivial conversation going on that you don't want to leave to go out to the kitchen. And I want to just back up here and just talk a little bit about the idea of guests, because there's also several different ways to approach guests, and you've already alluded to them. One of them is, let's have everybody in the neighborhood. Let's have, 3 other couples who live near us, or just something like that. Or let's have the people we always have over at this time of year, or something like that. And then there's the curated guest list. There's the scenario where the host thinks, well, those people might enjoy meeting these people, and then maybe there's sort of another couple that has some other purpose. And I know that you've done that kind of thing too, where you're trying to match food with wine and food with food, but it's also people with people. And say something about that.
Well, I will confess to really liking that. It's not the only kind of party that we throw over here, but it is one kind of party. And Colin, there's inevitably this moment, if we're setting the table with a certain amount of formality where, I've made, let's say there are going to be 8 people there and I've made the name cards. And then there comes that delicious sort of dating game moment when you're just putting the place cards around the table and you try this and you try that. And you imagine, well, how is she going to talk with him? Ooh, that might not work too well. Let's switch them around. But wait a sec. Now you're next to a spouse. I take a kind of mischievous delight in this. You have to, one consideration is who are the extroverts and who are the introverts, and how are you going to match them up. I'm an extrovert, and my wife is an introvert, and so that's the sort of a fundamental category of social life. You need to have a good balance of extroverts and introverts, and then know how they're gonna mesh together. Or you can invite Colin, he can invite you and get an extrovert and an introvert in one, two in one. But for my wife, for whom certain kinds of parties are a real trial, and as she constantly points out, the technical characterological definition of the extrovert is the person who takes out energy from a social situation, and the introvert is the person who has to expend energy to get through a social situation. So I often try to put sometimes one introvert next to an extrovert, because the introvert can just kind of hang there and absorb, or interestingly, 2 introverts next to each other, because they can then sort of define a small, quiet, private conversation there between the 2 of them, which is often a survival strategy for the introvert at a dinner party. So it is something that, I do think about.
I'm wondering if you think that there is a social good that comes out of the idea of dinner parties, apart from or above and beyond people just having a really good time and maybe not wanting to leave and learning a new recipe and meeting a new person, or maybe that is part of the social good. In other words, if we have a lot of dinner parties, if we host and go to a lot of dinner parties, do you think, is it quixotic to suggest that it might improve society? And if it's not quixotic, how would it improve society?
Well, interestingly, if you think about movies that center on dinner parties, a lot of them, if not most of them, are about dinner party catastrophes, whether it's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, or the Celebration, that Thomas Vinterberg film about a family celebrating Dad's 60th birthday. It just deteriorates into confessions of sexual abuse and incest, and or the Hannibal Lecter sequel where they eat Ray Liotta's brain. So there's something about the dinner party that conduces to a sort of a portal to disaster and even to terror. But the actual dinner party is salutary in many ways, and one is introducing people who don't know each other but who are part of the same community, and we've done that at almost all of our parties. So that's and in a non professional networking way. You know how you're at an event, you become suddenly aware this is really just about professional networking. You suddenly makes you just want to leave. But this is just about, a party where some people don't know each other is about human networking. And it's also about cherishing and preserving. It's sad that we have to talk about preserving this real in-depth, leisurely, unpressured conversation. You probably saw that piece in the Times the other day by the restaurateur who talked about the future of restaurants being places where essentially the whole experience is going to be compressed and fast. And this was a guy whose traditional restaurants hadn't been able to make it. He'd ended up opening places that are sort of like the Doro restaurants in our market, which are terrific places, but which emphasize quality food at hyperspeed. Mm-hmm. And the chef said in his new restaurant model, you order as soon as you're at the door, and yes, you have a set table, but the food is delivered basically once you get there. And he said that this eliminated 20 minutes of profit-killing dead time between the people sitting at the table and them getting their food. Well, that 20 minutes of profit-killing dead time used to be called dinner conversation. Mm-hmm. And as you know, Colin, if you're at a party that goes on for 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours around a dinner table, that results in kinds of conversation that have an architecture, I don't know if that's the right word, that have a script or an unscripted nature or a melodic flow that increasingly isn't part of human interactions in our culture. So I think it has, a civilizational preservation role in resisting the implacable attenuation of forms of language that's part of the efficiency of our culture.
One thing that I always feel terrible about is every once in a while, for example, I met Gary Greenberg at, I think, one of your dinner parties, and he's wound up being on the show a whole bunch of times, and as a result of that. So that's like a tangible thing. But every once in a while you meet, I met this wonderful, wonderful guy at one of the very few dinner parties I've been to in the last 3 or 4 years. And he was just fascinating. We just clicked and hit it off. And he said to me something like, I don't usually say this, but we should talk again or something. And then we never did. And it has a lot to do with my own social anxiety and whatever. But there is something very sad about that in the fullness of the moment at the dinner party, you think, oh, yes, this is somebody who I could become friends with. And then you just don't. And I really want to ask you a question about the survival of this form. Do you think your daughter will host and go to dinner parties the way that you have done? There's this kind of idea, too, that millennials and Zers and I guess Gen Alpha coming online here, they don't necessarily have the resources. They don't necessarily have the space in the places that they live. They don't really think about this thing that way, maybe because they're young. Maybe they'll start to. But I wonder your thoughts about the durability of the idea of the dinner party.
So the desire to be together in groups and to connect with each other in ways that work, for instance, doesn't necessarily make possible, I think, is an inextinguishable part of the human being. The desire to celebrate communally with food. So I don't think it's going away, and I don't think you have to have terrific resources beyond your imagination, and you can make it. So I'm going to a dinner party this Saturday that Peter Roos, who's the head of the Mark Twain House, is hosting. We actually won this in a raffle, and he's cooking a bunch of. He and his wife are preparing a bunch of meals that represent things that Mark Twain would have eaten at dinner parties of his. And certainly a bunch of time is going to go into that, and some resources. And in between courses, he's going to say a few things about Twain and read a few excerpts. But you could do a very low cost version of this for a bunch of people who are into Twain, who are still going to read the passages, say what they love about Twain, eat or drink something that is referred to in some of Twain's writing, and have a blast. And I think people will not stop, despite the fact. I mean, to me, the one big danger of this, and I won't go into this, it's a topic you and I have handled many times before, but the inroads that digital devices have made upon people's competence in dealing with each other face to face is a bit of a challenge for this. But maybe they'll just do these events digitally, but they will still do them.
So one last question. So every week you read the New York Times Book Review, and the New York Times Book Review, they always feature an author, and there's sort of a Q&A, and the penultimate or ultimate question is invariably dream dinner party, which is interesting too, that it's enough of a model that the New York Times persists on asking authors who, living or dead, you would invite to a dinner party. By the way, Shakespeare, they totaled them up recently. Shakespeare's way ahead of everybody else. So I don't know. I'm putting you on the spot, but it's the kind of question I also know that you could answer. What's your dream, I assume, literary dinner party, living or dead? Pick 3 guests.
Well, I was going to say Vladimir Nabokov, but though his novels were tremendously important to me, and he was an erudite person, he also was known to be terrifically grouchy and kind of harsh in his way. So I'm going to say no to Vladimir Nabokov. I would have to say Jane Austen would be there, because there are many dinner parties in her books. Similarly, I might pick Karen Blixen, Isaac Dinesen, who wrote the material behind Babbitt's Feast, and I have to say yes to John Updike, because his genteel articulateness was so freakish that I would just love to hear some of those perfect multi-clause sentences roll impromptu off his tongue over a glass of whiskey.
Doesn't Nicholson Baker describe seeing him eating turkey at a Hojo's or something? And it seemed like he was really enjoying that stringy Howard Johnson's turkey. So like he'd be very impressed if you gave him something nicer than that.
But I have to say, MFK Fisher, I mean, obviously I could go on in here. Because MFK Fisher wrote so beautifully and poignantly about food, she'd have to be there too.
All right, so we have to stop, but we are going to talk more about dinner parties later in the show. Rand Richards Cooper, fiction writer, contributing editor at Commonweal, and the restaurant critic for the Hartford Courant, and host extraordinaire. Thanks for talking to us.
Thanks, Colin.
Supper time. Yeah, it's supper time. Oh, it's supper time. Very best time of day. It's supper time. Yeah, it's supper time. And when supper time comes, can supper be far away?
Pretty babies in the kitchen this glorious day. Smell the gravy simmering nearly half a mile away. Lady morning glory, I say good morning to you. Chirpy little chickadee told me that my baby is too. She really went to get the frying pan when she saw me coming. Gonna taste it for it goes
Oh,
to waste. Honey,
I can listen to Joe Williams sing for a long, long time. So I have to say one other thing about that song. I'm only saying it to older people, all right? I'm not saying it to young people because it will mean nothing to them. But that song was written by Steve Allen. See, I told you it wouldn't mean anything to you. All right, so it's time to talk a little bit about the history of the dinner party. I alluded to it at the top here, but Julia Skinner is a culinary historian and food writer whose work includes the book Our Fermented Lives. I should check the index, see if I'm in there. And she's also here to talk to us about the past, the present, and perhaps the future of the dinner party. Julia Skinner, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me. So
through history, I mentioned this at the top of the show, but through history, there's a way in which dinner parties are a bit of a flex sometimes, particularly, I mean, in Greco-Roman culture. Well, we should begin by just letting you say, Greco-Roman culture is kind of the first time we really see something that could conceivably wear the name dinner party, right?
Yeah, I mean, Greco-Roman culture and in ancient Egypt, both you see, but in that time and kind of that, that space, we see the first, what we would call a dinner party emerge.
And they have space for it. They have the Greeks, I think, seem to have benches that only men sit on, and young people sit on the floor and women stand. By the time we get to the Romans, there's room on the bench for women as well. But it also seems to be, and one of the evidences we have of this is the Satyricon by Petronius, this idea that if you particularly maybe are nouveau riche, if you are an arriviste, this is a way to make your statement to society about how much money you've got, what you can possibly afford to do, what sorts of excesses you might be able to commit yourself to. And I think not only in ancient Rome, but it becomes kind of a pattern. But I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, no, I like this phrasing you're using of it being a flex, because it really, if we look at the dinner party in various times in history, that sort of flex to varying degrees is very much there. Like I can afford all these ingredients. I can afford, the best china, the best, whatever. And so they definitely started flexing in that way, but that was not unique to them. There's, the history of people renting pineapples and having them on their tables at dinner here in the South. There's all of these different examples of, I can get better stuff than you, and this is a good way for me to show it off.
Yeah, and I think another thing, I don't know if you've watched this, but the series The Gilded Age, I mean, first of all, in movies, just generally speaking, adaptations of Jane Austen or things like Gosford Park, Downton Abbey, Upstairs, Downstairs, you see the amount of time and attention that is placed on the dinner party, often by not the people who are going to be sitting down at the table, but by a whole bunch of other people who are going to be cooking the food and serving it. But in the series The Gilded Age, which I think has run on HBO, you see in particular another nouveau riche arriviste played by Carrie Coon, who wants to make a huge splash in American society, in New York society, and does things like steal a butler or something. And then there are these incredible debates about, I guess there were two different ways of setting a formal table at that moment, and you could see the two butlers having arguments about it. I mean, this was how you conveyed status, right?
Yeah, so the Victorians are very interesting, and kind of that, late 19th, early 20th century period of time is really interesting to think about because, I mean, the Victorians, when we think of them now, we still have this perception of like, lots of rules, very formal, kind of stuffy, and, but also a lot of kind of extra elegant, stuff going on. And we see that with the food too, and with the dinner parties. I mean, and having the right forks and the right plates and the right, all of the different utensils and everything was a very important part of conveying status, because if you didn't have the right stuff, then it was clear that you were like, oh, you're not one of us. It was part of this kind of like class-based, inside outside sort of code. And so, if I went to a Victorian dinner party and I, used my lettuce fork on pickles, people would, they'd be all aghast. They wouldn't know what to do about it. But yeah, thankfully we've calmed down a little bit since then.
No, I still can't handle that when somebody uses the lettuce fork on a pickle and not the pickle fork.
It's very upsetting.
Right. But as you're suggesting, this is another thing that happens, is that the table setting becomes incredibly variegated, that it becomes a set of rules that is almost inscrutable of what you use and when you use it and where it sits on the table and all that. But meanwhile, I mean, that's sort of among the one percenters. Meanwhile, there's another thing that's happening that I would assume kicks in a little bit in the Victorian period, a little bit as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The numbers of people who could conceivably have, for example, a dining table and some matching plates to put on it, that starts to increase, I assume, during the Industrial Revolution, as there's a different group of people who can maybe amass those kinds of resources.
Yes, but it has roots a little farther back. So if we look at, so let's talk about the Middle Ages, and you still have those big, long, kind of tables in this big, great hall where everybody sits. I mean, again, we're talking about rich people here, right? And then when we go forward a couple hundred years, say 1600s or so, people start to have separate rooms with a smaller dining table in it and hosting smaller parties. And then so there's kind of a social precedent for that, even if it is among the wealthy, that kind of mentally prepares, people as a collective to think about, oh, dinner party doesn't have to be, everybody at this giant long table in a huge room. Like, it can be something smaller. So yeah, when we start to amass more wealth, growing middle class, all of these things, you see that sort of party becoming more common, in like middle class households too.
Yeah, and it's interesting how it evolves, and it may evolve a little bit differently in Europe and England than it does in the United States. Because my sense has always been that when Jefferson creates Monticello and there's a dining room, people are going, "Whoa, it's just like a whole room where there's a dining table. That's the whole point of the room." There's a sense that he is doing something that's maybe not exactly a flex, but he's making maybe some kind of statement, possibly one that he understands is coming over from Europe.
Mm-hmm. That's probably a little bit of a flex. But yeah, I think in Europe, they had much longer traditions of that. I mean, just because they had longer traditions of having, these sorts of dinner parties in the dominant cultures there. Whereas in the US, it was much more common in starting in the Victorian period, Industrial Revolution, all of that.
So I assume maybe the biggest boom and democratizing of this idea of a dinner party is post-World War II. You have a sudden onset of affluence. You have people who've kind of expanded their understanding of what the world consists of. And you also have a whole industry and advertising attached to that industry to sell people stuff that they can then exhibit their ability to be gracious hosts with. Right? I assume that sort of Eisenhower era, the baby boom, the original baby boom period, is a great time for new dinner party hosting.
Yeah, I mean, but it's still a part of a longer theme of, like you and Rand were talking about this, like bringing people over, this flexing, but like also connecting with people. And so you have a new boom in that you have maybe different dishes being served. We do start to see around that time a little bit of a move towards the slightly more casual dinner party. Like we're still talking about people sitting down at the table having their plate and their, kind of their own table setting, but it's not quite as intense as a Victorian dinner. And so we're starting to see a little bit of a move towards the more casual dining during that time, but it's still, yeah, I mean, it is still very much a flex of like, look, I have all these nice new appliances. Look at this fancy stove that I have. Look at this, nice new table. Yeah, still definitely a bit of that.
And I think also there's the ritual of the dinner party starts to become a little bit more ingrained. Not the Downton Abbey ritual, which includes the men staying at the table and the women going someplace else or whatever the hell they do, and cigars and all this stuff. But this sort of idea that people arrive, there's a cocktail hour, then you go to the table, all that stuff starts to maybe be, once again, a little bit more democratized, more people kind of have access to that idea. What I'm wondering about, Julia, is the thing that is in some ways the beating heart of this episode, which is how well all of that is traveling into the 21st century, how well it's traveling into 2023. It has been suggested in various places that millennials, just for a welter of different reasons, are not going to do at least some of that stuff.
I think this is interesting because, when you do historical research, you have the advantage of seeing that these things naturally change over time. That a tradition doesn't have to stay completely static to remain a tradition. And so I think thinking of dinner parties in terms of the undergirding things that, make them dinner parties. So in our case, that would be bringing people together and kind of having these gatherings, and maybe the flex part of it either, morphs or shifts or kind of goes away a little bit. But maybe not. Maybe it just appears in different ways. But I think, the gathering people together is, we're never going to stop doing that. We're never going to want to stop eating with our friends, whether we officially call it a dinner party or not.
And yeah, I mean, I feel as though millennials will experiment with this. I mean, in a way, everybody has. And if you go through the decades, there's different things and different things getting served and stuff like that. But I'm also wondering, and millennials won't stay young forever, so we don't really know what they're going to be like when they're 50, 55, 60. But I think there's been a striving, and this was alluded to a little bit with Rand, for a kind of perfection, right? I'm going to set up my table really nicely. I'm going to make some wonderful Julia Child dish, that kind of thing. The cooking's going to be impressive. The wine's going to be impressive. It almost doesn't seem sustainable for post-recession millennials to think that way. And it also doesn't even strike me I don't know that much about them, but it feels like it's maybe not even going to be in their nature to think about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't want to speak for all millennials, but being one, I think that, we tend to have, a lot of us kind of came of age at this time when, yeah, like you said, maybe priorities are shifting, finances are shifting, like, the world maybe looks a bit different. One thing that I definitely have noticed is that there's maybe still sometimes people will strive for perfection, but kind of in different ways. Maybe they'll try to try a different format of, hosting a meal or something like that. But what I really notice is much more of a collaborative effort. So maybe people cooking together, having more potlucks, something where there's kind of a collective effort towards making rather than, you all come to my house, I've spent all day cooking, now I set everything in front of you, you eat it, I clean it all up, which I'm very grateful I don't have to do very much of.
Right. I think that is a lot healthier in a lot of ways. I mean, on the other hand, I think in the pre-interview with McCusker, you might have mentioned like a kimchi making party. I don't know. I don't know if I want to have to go to somebody's house and then make kimchi, but then I'm old and ossified.
I mean, the kimchi making parties are a little different because you're all preparing food, and kind of that's the point of the party, is the preparing, less than about, then eating what you prepare, at least right then.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think I personally, I struggle with this because, like you, I don't like to have people in the kitchen,
mm-hmm.
right? When I'm cooking, I don't want to have, everybody in there talking with me. And so, cooking together, in my tiny kitchen at my house here doesn't sound very appealing, but coming together and making food in another way,
mm-hmm.
like if we're outside on the grill or we're in another environment, I think that shifts it. And I kind of wonder if maybe having things like the kimchi making parties, the kimjong parties, and then, incorporating that with some other dinner party aspect. I mean, there's so many directions it could go, but I think the community element is going to still be the most important.
All right, Julia Skinner, final question. Same one, dream dinner party. You can have anybody living or dead show up and eat food with you. Who's it going to be?
Oh my gosh, it's very hard to pick. I would have a very long list, but the first that come to mind, top of my head, are Neil Gaiman, one of my favorite authors, Julia Child, one of my favorite chefs, and also, of course, a fellow namesake. And then David Zilber, who does a lot of fermentation work and co-wrote the Noma fermentation book, because he does a really good job of connecting ideas in food with ideas, in other kind of aspects of our life. And I think those three would be very interesting to hear in conversation.
So is Neil going to leave Amanda at home? I'm just wondering how that's all going to work out.
I mean, I guess he can bring her along.
All right.
That'd be great.
All right. Julia Skinner, culinary historian, food writer, whose work includes the book Our Fermented Lives. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to talk about, among other things, disasters.
Make sure you never miss the Colin McEnroe Show by subscribing to or following our podcast on any app. It is free. The senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show is Lily Tyson, whose boss is Katie Tolarski, whose boss is Mark Contreras, who reports to the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. We don't know why. Back to the show.
And that was the voice of Kat Pastor, who's our technical producer today and most days. Today's show was produced by McCusker. Here's a fun fact that just came out recently. McCusker and I have both sung as children from the stage, different stages, the song Food, Glorious Food from Oliver, which you heard going out of that last segment. So I don't know why anybody would care about that, but I do. All right. It's kind of interesting, too. Another coincidence is our next guest is a good friend of our last guest. Nandita Gudbole is the author of several cookbooks, including, I'm going to screw this up, that's not part of the title, Masaledar, Classic Indian Spice Blends. She also writes the blog, Curry Cravings. Nandita, welcome to our show.
Hi there.
So you going to talk a little bit about other people's disasters.
Yes.
But you cook with a certain amount of pressure. You run in the past, and I think maybe now in the present as well, these supper clubs in Atlanta and L.A. where people buy tickets to attend. So that's, kind of a certain amount of pressure on you making a 7 to 8 course meal. And as I understand, go ahead, react to that. Yeah.
No, yes. And I actually was talking to people, and San Francisco is kind of getting added into that mix as well, because I go there often.
Well, there are foodies there too, and great ingredients and stuff like that as well. So we should say that one of your first adventures of this kind did include a disaster, not of your making. Explain that.
Yes, this was Mother Nature telling me that I really needed to get my game on and do it well. We threw a dinner party in the early part of my food space career, and there was a thunderstorm that night, and lightning struck and burnt the house down that was close to the entrance of our neighborhood. And essentially, there were 4 fire trucks that kept any guests from coming in. It was a pretty violent thunderstorm. Pretty much all of Atlanta was getting pummeled with rain, monsoon rain. And we had to redirect our guests to walk through the rain through a different neighborhood just so that they could make it in. And how do you save the day with that? We walked out with umbrellas and towels, and I made big pots of masala chai. And, we sat around and laughed about it. It was one of the most memorable dinner parties I've ever had.
Right. And I think there's one of the big lessons in there is it sounds like, I'm sure you had a moment of terror, but it also sounds like you relaxed into it. And a lot of the problems with dinner parties that feel like disasters happen, A, because something goes wrong, but also because people tense up because it's a performance to a certain degree.
I agree. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges is that we as a society have started putting pressure on ourselves about what we want to achieve out of a dinner party. I want to add something from and tag on to Julia's conversation from earlier. Like in Ayurveda, in Ayurvedic texts, way back in the 3rd and 4th century, there were rules for how a plate was being set and what were the rules of engagement at a dinner or a meal. And these are ingrained in our psyche about what is perfect and what isn't perfect and how should it go and what course comes after which course. So keeping all of that in mind, it becomes quite a challenge for most people to think about how they're going to go through this process. But if there are 2 parts of it. A dinner party is about people and food. And your job as a host is to kind of orchestrate that so that everything goes smoothly. Part of the stress that most people have is logistically not feeling prepared enough, or trying out really complicated dishes that have a lot of weight and expectations attached to them. For instance, if you have never made a dish, and dinner party is not the best day to start practicing those skills. So you're adding more undue pressure to yourself. So just kind of easing into your own strengths and saying to yourself, it's all going to be okay. It's going to be great. We're gathering as friends, or for me, it was a work pressure. But we're gathering, and we just have to think ahead. And of course, we can't anticipate Mother Nature intervening, but that could happen. So just think on your feet and move on. And everybody understands. I don't think we're living in the Roman ages where someone's going to turn up their noses at you.
Yes, one thing we learned just talking around the office is not only should you not be trying to make a dish for the first time, probably, you probably shouldn't. We just learned from one of our colleagues, try to use your newly purchased outdoor grill for the first time because she had the experience, or her now ex-husband had the experience of not being able to operate the grill at all, and kind of melting down over that. So yeah, don't do anything you haven't done before. And it sounds like you're saying two things about this. One thing is keep it relatively simple, or at least simple enough so that it matches your skills and your comfort level.
Absolutely.
And also prepare like hell. I mean, just sort of make sure that I guess you do spreadsheets and stuff to make sure you have the right ingredients.
Yeah, I used to OCD over this. I would actually have a spreadsheet on my refrigerator the week that we would have a dinner party. Again, remember, this is not everybody. I was doing it for work, so I needed it to be perfect. I didn't have staff. I was doing everything alone. So I didn't have anyone to delegate to. And I had, at that time, I had a little, child in elementary school, and I was parenting. And so you're juggling all these things and you're like, oh my God, I don't need to go to the grocery store 5 times. Mm-hmm. So I would literally create a spreadsheet the week before and say, these are my 15 dishes. And I had 15 dinners. So I would really need to know what I was doing. Mm. And I would have these, dishes, and I would choose. All of my dinners were themed. All of my dinners are themed. So I have a lot of staples, and I would reach in and create these masalas or blends. Incidentally, Masaladar has some of those blends, and I would rely on them to make an easy dish come together really quickly. Also, that is very, very flavorful. Not a lot of work goes into the actual dish. The work is done beforehand. And that is, kind of respecting your own sanity and respecting your time and what you can give to something. That just would make my life a lot easier. And run through the Excel spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. These are the things I need from this section of the grocery store. These are the things I need from the dairy aisle, or what have you. And at the end, I would even have, a column that would say, these are the things I can make ahead and put away up to 2 days in advance, 3 days in advance. Mm-hmm. So on the day of, all my food was being cooked on the day of. Everything would come out of the refrigerator, and it was ready to go, made fresh that morning. And I would have very few leftovers because I had thought it through.
Yeah.
We're
almost out of time here, and I want to get your thoughts about one or two things. I do want to quickly say that, I think when we watch movies about dinner parties, mm-hmm. it's usually the behavior of the guests, something that gets said, a fight that breaks out, or somebody confesses mm-hmm. to a murder or whatever. Whereas for those of us living in the real world, it's more, oh my God, the sauce is the consistency of peanut butter. How do I thin it? What's mm-hmm. happening here? But maybe the sort of the exception is alcohol. If your guests mm-hmm. get drunk, or I've been in situations where the cook, deals with the stress by maybe that mm-hmm. third glass of wine out in the kitchen. So I know, just in mm-hmm. like 30 seconds, you have warnings about that, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are ways to fix things. There are ways to, if you know your dish, if you've mm-hmm. made it before, you know what could go wrong. So mm-hmm. I think that really helps. Yeah. And, with people just getting drunk or, not understanding the rules of engagement at a dinner party, that's always a challenge for the host. And you just have to kind of take it in and know that you need to set the cutoff quantities for alcohol, especially when you go to a dinner party, so that you're not making an unsavory environment for everybody else.
That's great advice.
And okay. that's your responsibility.
So now we're really down to our last 30 seconds. Do you think the dinner party is going to survive? Is the dinner party going to? Yes. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, it is. My 20-year-old is in college on campus, and she told me last night she's going to throw a Friendsgiving party. She has no supplies, no nothing. And I said, how are you going to do it? Well, we're going to do a potluck. Mm-hmm. And I said, yes, and I was thinking about this, that the young people take cues from the adults in their life about how we deal with things like gatherings. Mm-hmm. And those are the rules of engagement. We kind of set the stage for them. Mm-hmm. So if we give them the tools and the confidence that they can do it, they're going to continue to that.
I hate to break in here, but we literally have to go. Nandita Garboli, thank you so much for joining us today.